Today, we're talking about pacing. Again. We're going to wrap up by discussing pacing at the plot or story level. Whereas last week we mainly focused on scene or micro level pacing, today is all about managing pacing over the course of an entire story. You've probably heard before that the length of any story is wholly arbitrary. You can take any story and reduce it down to 1 or 2 sentences or double its length, and it's still arguably the same story. Sure, this can dramatically reduce the enjoyability of that story, since not giving it room to breathe or dragging it out way longer than it needs to be are both problematic. A story can take 3 sentences or 3 novels to get through, and you as the author have full control over how long it takes. Any story has an ideal length, an ideal rate at which events and plot points are delivered to the reader. And this rate is ultimately determined by the pacing of that story. So let's talk about some of the ways that you can manage pacing at a higher level in your story and across your entire plot. This is, of course, in addition to the things that we've talked about before, how you manage pacing at the individual scene level. And of course, the pacing that you have at the level of individual scenes is going to have a major impact on the pacing of the overall story. But these are some things to consider nonetheless. In a larger work, you are likely going to have more than one plot. These subplots are a crucial tool to managing pacing. I've talked about subplots in an earlier video, and there's a lot that you need to consider when incorporating one into your story, but from a pacing standpoint, it's important to understand their effect. Subplots mainly affect pacing by serving as a sort of distraction. This can be quite useful if your main plot needs some more room to breathe, or if you want something to break up a slower part of the main plot. In this sort of situation, you can switch to a subplot that is either moving faster or perhaps moving slower than the main plot, depending on what you need to do. In fact, having the faster-paced parts of a subplot play out during the slower-paced parts of the main plot can be useful so that the subplot doesn't get overshadowed. That line took like 15 takes for me to say. Subplots can serve as a point of contrast, adding some variety and different points of interest in your story. During lulls in the main plot, you can have a subplot that ramps up in intensity in order to keep the reader engaged. Using subplots this way is a good way to keep the reader interested during less than interesting passages. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't make an effort to keep the main plot interesting, and I would look at any of these sort of lulls and see if they actually need to be there. Adding subplots just to patch up a boring section of your main plot is not a good solution. It's much better to just make the main plot less boring. Every subplot needs to have a purpose, and that purpose needs to go beyond just propping up your main plot. The main utility of subplots when it comes to pacing is that they give us a break from the main plot. You can do something similar by going back in time. We've talked about flashbacks before, and they aren't without their own controversies, but these types of scenes where you go back to explore a character's backstory or another event from the past are also a good way to manage pacing. Just like with subplots, flashbacks serve as a contrast and distraction from the main events of the story. They can give you that breathing room when you want to slow things down, or depending on the nature of the flashback, they can give you an opportunity to actually speed up the pace. Because of the way they break from the story, it's natural for flashbacks to slow down the pace. Flashbacks are particularly useful after impactful or momentous events in your main plot. During slower moments of the main story, flashbacks can be used instead to speed things up. For example, a character might be introspecting about something that's happened in the main plot, and you can accentuate that with a flashback that is more quickly paced. If you can couple the events of the flashback to what the character is actually introspecting about, then you can get the same effect of that introspection, but in a much faster paced scene, while also potentially revealing something about the character's backstory. This is tricky to do, but if you're able to pull it off, it can make getting through slower parts of the main plot a bit easier. I've mentioned before that pacing is as much about how fast a story feels as it is how fast it's actually happening. Scenes written with direct action, where we are actually seeing what's happening, are generally going to feel faster paced than scenes written in summary, even though the latter technically takes less time to get through. This is one of the contradictory things about pacing. Even though a summarized version of a section takes less words, it will not feel as fast as one that's told with a play-by-play of events. Longer works often contain sections where there's a lot of events that are being summarized very quickly. If the character is taking some kind of a long voyage, you might just summarize it over 2 or 3 pages rather than breaking down every single scene of every single step along the way. Even though these passages take less time, they are going to feel slower paced. Part of this has to do with the emotional investment in the events. You can describe entire eras of history or the entire life of a character, but if it's only quickly summarized, the reader is unlikely to be engaged. One of the most important aspects of managing pacing across an entire longer story is understanding when you need to summarize and when you need to actually play out the scene. Over summarizing, where you gloss over too many important events too quickly, or under summarizing, when you perhaps give too much detail for the amount of actual events taking place, can both cause problems with your pacing. You can decide if a scene should be played out in its entirety or just summarized by looking at how many important events happen over the course of that scene. Events that are exciting but don't really have an impact on the story can likely be glossed over. Remember that pacing is not just how fast a story feels, but how fast it's actually happening. And going too fast is just as much of a problem as going too slowly. So hopefully this video didn't go too fast or too slowly. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this video and found the advice in it useful. Be sure and watch the other pacing videos in this series if you haven't already. And also check out all my other writing advice related videos and subscribe to my channel. I post new videos every Wednesday. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.